Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to outline phenomenal conservatism in epistemology. Phenomenal conservatism is an account of justification, of what it takes for our beliefs to be justified, and it has become very influential in the recent philosophical literature. Before I get into this, I want to say that if you're interested in discussing this topic or any other topics related to philosophy, I do have a Discord, so I will link that in the description. Please go and check that out. Additionally, if you want to support this channel, I have both a Patreon and a PayPal link. With the PayPal link, you can give a one-off donation should you wish to. Obviously, any monetary support that people provide is greatly appreciated, and it really helps this. Helps the channel keep going. So yes, I appreciate anybody who considers that. Okay, well, with that said, let's get right into it. So the basic idea of phenomenal conservatism is very simple. According to phenomenal conservatism, here's the summary. This comes from Michael Huemer, who's one of the primary defenders of phenomenal conservatism. According to phenomenal conservatism, if it seems to a subject S that P, then in the absence of defeaters, S has at least some justification for believing that P. Basically, we are justified in believing that things are the way they seem to be, provided there are no good reasons to doubt that belief. So a first question here then is, okay, well, what do we mean by, like, seems? What is a seeming? So a seeming is a kind of appearance, and this can involve a very broad variety of mental states. There are perceptual seemings. So I scan my eyes across my room and I have the perceptual impression that there is a white wall in front of me. So it perceptually seems to me that there is a white wall in front of me. So you see, perception generates seemings. Similarly, there are mnemonic seemings. I try to recall what I did yesterday, and I seem to remember eating pasta for dinner. There are introspective seemings, when I turn my attention to my own mind and I find that I seem to be happy right now. I'm in a good mood. That's how my current state seems to me, right? There are intellectual seemings, or what philosophers sometimes call intuitions. So think about a basic mathematical claim, like 1 + 1 = 2. That proposition just immediately strikes me as true, right? Like, I think about 1 + 1 = 2, and it's like, yeah, that's just true. That's just how it strikes my mind. It's quite difficult to come up with a justification for it. If somebody says, like, well, why is it the case that 1 + 1 = 2? It's not obvious what to say. It just seems to be true. So in this case, I'm not perceiving or remembering or introspecting anything. Instead, it's an intellectual intuition. Similarly, if I think about slavery, well, slavery strikes me as morally wrong. When I consider, depriving people of liberty, when I consider the conditions in which slaves live, I have this strong sense that it ought not to be done. Again, that's not a perception, it's not a memory, it's a kind of intellectual intuition, right? It seems to be the case that slavery is wrong. So, perception, memory, introspection, various forms of intellectual intuition, all of these generate seemings. Now, it's important to note that on the standard view here, seemings are not beliefs. So seemings are appearances, or maybe broadly, like, experiences of a certain kind. So, like, I'm presented with an appearance, and this appearance has a special kind of effect on me. It inclines me to hold a particular belief, perhaps, but it's not itself a belief. So, like, the visual appearance, when I open my eyes and I look straight ahead, that inclines me to believe that there's a white wall in front of me. So it's like there's some feature of my experience that's, like, nudging me towards that belief. But the seeming is not itself a belief. So you can see the difference here if you consider something like the Muller-Lyer illusion. When you look at these two lines, it seems to be the case, it perceptually seems to be the case, that the top line is longer than the bottom line. That's how those lines appear in perception. But I do not believe that the top line is longer than the bottom line. I know, having measured these lines with a ruler, that they are the same length. So we can, and we often do, overrule our seemings. And of course, that's just to say that sometimes there are defeaters for what seems to be the case. When I have access to such defeaters, I will not believe that the seeming is veridical. I will not believe the seeming. So this brings us, of course, to the second aspect of phenomenal conservatism, which is seemings provide justification in the absence of defeaters. So a defeater here is just a reason to doubt, right? So basically what we're saying is that seemings, they only provide prima facie justification. Seemings are presumed to be accurate until they are shown to be false. So the burden of proof, as it were, is on the skeptic who denies the seeming. If it seems to me that P, and there are no defeaters for P, and there's no reason to doubt P, then it's reasonable for me to accept P. But there may be defeaters. And so broadly speaking then, Huemer gives two types of defeaters that might obtain for some seeming. First of all, there are rebutting defeaters. A rebutting defeater is evidence that P is false. So when I bring up a ruler against the lines in the Muller-Lyer illusion, and I see that like the ruler measures each line as being the same length, it says like 5 centimeters or whatever for both of them, well, that gives me just direct evidence that it is false that the top line is longer than the bottom line. So I just have direct evidence that the seeming is false. Then second, there are undercutting defeaters. An undercutting defeater is evidence that the seeming is unreliable or is not truth-tracking. So suppose I look at a cup and it visually appears red. So it seems to me that the cup is red. But then I learn that the cup is illuminated entirely by red lights. Well, that's compatible with the proposition that the cup is red, right? It may be the case that the cup is red. But the problem is that in the conditions that we have specified, the cup would appear red even if it was some other colour like white. So because of the unusual lighting conditions, my visual appearances can no longer be trusted to reliably track the true colours of objects. So seemings can be defeated. But, there are plenty of cases where I have no such defeaters, and in those cases I may rely on how things seem. The basic idea here then is that seemings are the starting points of our inquiries. In the end, working through the evidence, working through the arguments, I might come to hold beliefs that depart significantly from how things initially seem. But even those new beliefs will be based on other seemings. So think again about that Muller-Lyer illusion. I know that measuring lines with a ruler is a more reliable means of determining length than just relying on like unaided visual impressions. So when I put the ruler against those lines, I trust the ruler, right? So I override the perceptual seeming. But how do I know that the ruler is more reliable? Well, ultimately that rests on seemings. It rests on various visual and tactile appearances of rulers. It's going to rest on sort of, I guess, kind of broad theories or models of how physical objects work, and those theories and models are themselves going to be drawn on, going to be based on sort of perceptual and intellectual seemings, etc. So what happens is I guess we start with a whole bunch of seemings, and then sometimes we have to overrule seemings, but ultimately our beliefs are going to be based on how things seem. So seemings provide prima facie justification. If it seems that P, and I have no good grounds for doubting that, then I'm going to be justified in believing that P. Okay, that is the position, but why should we take this position seriously? Why should we believe phenomenal conservatism? Well, Huemer presents a few different arguments. I won't go through all of them, but I'll go through some. So first of all, there's an appeal to the notion of epistemic rationality. What is our goal when we engage in inquiries? Well, we want to believe true things, and we want to avoid believing false things. The question is, how do we satisfy this goal? And then the claim is going to be that what it is. So, what exactly is epistemic rationality? And the thought is that it's epistemically rational for S to do X provided that X appears from S's point of view to be an effective way of satisfying the goals of believing truths and disbelieving falsehoods. So it's like epistemic rationality is a matter of like what, right? What's the best way of like achieving the goal of inquiry? And the thought is that phenomenal conservatism aligns with this, because if I suppose that it seems to me that P, and I have no reason for doubting that P, so like it seems to me that there's a white wall in front of me and I have no reason for doubting that there's a white wall in front of me, then from my own point of view, believing that there is a white wall in front of me, that's going to appear to be an effective means of believing true things. That's the thought, right? This phenomenal conservatism aligns with a very kind of intuitive account of what epistemic rationality amounts to. I don't know, I mean, I must say I find this argument a little bit puzzling because, well, if it seems to me that P, then of course it will seem, from my point of view, that believing P will achieve the goal of believing truths. I mean, it almost sounds like that's just a slightly more convoluted way of saying that it seems to me that P. So like, let's say it seems to me that P, well then it must also be the case that it seems to me that P is true, in which case it must seem to me that believing P will involve believing a truth, and there's something kind of trivial about that. So maybe there's a worry there. Okay, another point in favour of phenomenal conservatism is that it supposedly provides a response to skepticism. Skepticism is a classic problem for epistemology, right? I mean, how can I know anything at all? Take the skeptical problem of the external world. A standard skeptical argument against the external world is the brain in the vat argument. So, if I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, I don't know that I have hands. I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know I have hands. Of course, the brain in the vat is just one among many skeptical scenarios, and the skeptic is going to present a whole bunch of skeptical scenarios. She's going to say, look, there's no way of ruling out these skeptical scenarios. So you don't know that whether or not you're in any of these scenarios, so you don't really know that there's an external world, which means you don't know that you have hands. The point is that we form beliefs about the world based on our experiences, and yet our experiences are compatible with a host of alternative hypotheses on which there is no external world at all. So looks like I don't know that I have hands, right? That's a bit of a problem. That's, for many philosophers, that's not a conclusion that they're happy with. Now, phenomenal conservatism, it is argued, solves this problem straightforwardly. Because when I have particular visual experiences, it seems to me that I do have hands. So, it's not just that I have particular visual sensations of colour and shape and so on. These sensations are accompanied by a seeming, and the seeming has the content, I have hands, or maybe just there are two hands, right? So, in the absence of defeaters, I have some justification for believing that I have hands. Now, although it's true that my current experiences are logically compatible with skeptical scenarios, such as the brain in the vat scenario, actually, experience is not silent between these skeptical hypotheses and the external world hypothesis. And that's because, my current experiences include the perceptual seeming that I have hands. And that gives me reason to believe that I have hands. So the skeptic will say that there's nothing in experience that allows us to rule out skeptical hypotheses. Now, it's true that our experience is logically consistent with these hypotheses. So it's logically possible that I'm a brain in a vat, given my experience. But the stronger claim that nothing in experience gives me reason to favour one hypothesis over the other is false, at least according to phenomenal conservatism. Because experience includes seemings, and it seems to me that I have hands. And so that, at least as far as the phenomenal conservative is concerned, that tells against the skeptical hypotheses. So actually, experience does allow us to maybe not rule out skeptical hypotheses, but it gives us good reason to favour the external world hypothesis. And so you get a nice, tidy response to skepticism, or at least to some skeptical arguments. And of course, this kind of argument can be applied in many other domains. So phenomenal conservatism has been used to defend moral realism, for instance. I have moral intuitions about various kinds of behaviour. As I said, it seems to me that enslaving people is wrong. So the claim then is that in the absence of defeaters, I have some justification for believing it's a fact that enslaving people is wrong. And obviously you can hopefully see how, yeah, this type of argument can be appealed to in a whole range of philosophical debates. So, you know, phenomenal conservatism is a powerful tool for people who like to hold beliefs about things. And that's, I mean, one big reason why it has become so influential is that it seems like we can apply it in so many different contexts to, you know, justify more realist accounts. Okay, one of the more powerful arguments in favour of phenomenal conservatism is that there is no alternative. Phenomenal conservatism, it is argued, is the only option for a theory of justification. Basically, the point here is that all beliefs that have any plausible claim to being justified will ultimately be based on Seemings. So even if we take very sophisticated beliefs like the Big Bang model, well, all of these ultimately rest on Seemings, right? They ultimately rest on the visual appearances of splotches on a graph, for instance. Scientific theories are tested against the observable data, so ultimately they're tested against perceptual Seemings. And, you know, I mean, we've obviously built up from Seeming, you know, we've built up these incredibly sophisticated theoretical structures, you know, and these remarkably, yeah, again, incredibly sophisticated chains of inferences and so on. So, like, you know, we've moved very far from just the initial Seemings, but ultimately these theories rest on just how things seem. They rest on perceptual Seemings in the case of science. So the point is, like, okay, how do I actually proceed in forming beliefs? Well, I start by taking some proposition P. I now need to weigh the case for and against P in my mind. Perhaps I will consider some of the arguments for and against P. Now, let's say I take some argument for P. Well, having an argument for P is only going to be useful if I can evaluate the premises of the argument. Do I accept those premises or not? Well, okay, now I have some other propositions to consider. So now I could consider further arguments for and against each premise of this original argument. In practice, that kind of process is not going to go on for long. Instead, I'm going to get to a point where some premises will just seem true to me, in which case I accept them, or at least I provisionally accept them, and some premises will not seem true to me, in which case I won't accept them, right? Like, that's it, right? That's as far as it goes, and that's the only option. There's just no plausible alternative to this, right? So, like, let's think this through. In principle, it looks like there are 4 options. So when I'm trying to weigh up whether or not to accept some proposition P, and I produce an argument for P, right? Like, okay, how do I then evaluate the premises of that argument? Well, there are going to be 4 options. Option number 1 is to consider the arguments for and against each premise before I accept that premise. But clearly, that will mean producing an infinite series of arguments, which is impossible. So, okay, option number 2 is just to accept nothing whatsoever, right? Like, I might decide, since, you know, there will always be premises that I cannot justify by further argument, maybe I should just withhold judgment. I just withhold judgment from any proposition. So I just go in for skepticism. But that is just to give up on inquiry entirely. Like, if you accept option number 2, you're just not playing the game anymore, right? So then option number 3 is I could accept some premises that do not seem to be true to me. But like, why on earth would anyone do that? I mean, that just, like, that would just be crazy, right? Like, what's the motive? Like, what? Right? Why would you do that? If it doesn't seem to be true to you, why on earth would you accept the premises? So then you have option number 4, which is to accept the premises that seem to me to be true. And that's what phenomenal conservatism prescribes. That's what it says you should do. So the thought is, look, option number 4 is the only option that is even in the ballpark of being a plausible way to conduct inquiry. And option number 4 is phenomenal conservatism. So, as Huemer puts it, and I quote, "When P seems to you to be true, and there are no grounds for doubting it, so no defeaters, what more are you looking for? This is as good as it gets." So this point, this no alternative argument leads to a further argument, which is that the denial of phenomenal conservatism is self-defeating. The basic argument is this. So, like, first of all, we have this claim that we've just seen that all beliefs that are plausibly justified are going to be based on seemings. And then second, the claim is that a belief is justified only if it is based on a source that provides justification. So I think this is fairly uncontroversial, right? Like, if I believe that P and you ask me why, and I say, well, P is based on Q, then Q must be something that can justify P, right? Like, it must be such that it can provide justification. If Q can't provide justification, well, surely my belief that P is not justified. Or at least, it's not justified in virtue of being based on Q. So, you know, if you ask me what justifies my belief, I say, well, this belief is based on Q, and Q isn't the sort of thing that can provide justification, then, yeah, surely, like, my response is just kind of weird, right? So anyway, we have the argument. Premise 1, all beliefs that are plausibly justified are ultimately based on seemings. Premise 2, a belief is justified only if it is based on an adequate source of justification. So then we get the proposition that if seemings are not a source of justification, then all our beliefs are unjustified. Conclusion, if all our beliefs are unjustified, then the belief that seemings are not a source of justification is unjustified. So the belief that phenomenal conservatism is false is unjustified. So denial of phenomenal conservatism turns out to be self-defeating. It undercuts its own justification. Ultimately, our defense of epistemological theories is going to be based on seemings. When we evaluate different epistemological theories, we appeal to our intellectual intuitions about particular cases. So, like, if I think that phenomenal conservatism is incorrect, that's going to be because either it just seems to me that phenomenal conservatism is incorrect, or it seems to me that phenomenal conservatism is incompatible with other things that seem to me to be correct. So it had better be the case that seemings provide prima facie justification, but that's just what phenomenal conservatism says. So from the no alternative argument, we can then present this self-defeat argument. So a standard response to both of these types of arguments is to contend that only some appearances justify, not all of them. So consider, for instance, a kind of traditional empiricism, which would say that seemings that are based on perception, introspection, memory, maybe certain conceptual seemings can provide justification. But then this traditional type of empiricist denies that other types of seemings, so in particular, like intellectual seemings that involve substantive claims about the nature of the world, this type of empiricist denies that those provide justification. Whatever the merits of this type of view, it's not obviously self-defeating. So this type of empiricist would say, well, yes, all our beliefs in relevant cases are based on seemings, but only the right kind of seemings. And yes, seemings are a source of justification, but only the right kind of seemings, right? So whereas the phenomenal conservative just accepts all seemings, right? Like we might say, well, it's true that our beliefs are based on seemings, right? But it's not the case that just any seeming goes. Okay, so that's what the phenomenal conservative wants to say, is that, like, as far as seemings are concerned, anything goes, right? Have whatever seemings you want. They can provide prima facie justification. Whereas on this view, it's like it accepts the claim that all beliefs that are plausibly justified are based on seemings, but then it says only some seemings count. The question, of course, is what could motivate this kind of theory? Like, why should we suppose that some seemings are epistemically privileged? Phenomenal conservatism is a remarkably simple theory. For the phenomenal conservative, all seemings are on the same epistemic footing. So if we hold that some seemings provide justification and some do not, if we hold, for instance, that perceptual and introspective seemings provide justification but moral seemings do not, then we need to identify some epistemically relevant difference between them. So, that would then be the challenge, right? Like, well, what is this relevant difference? Okay, let's turn to some objections to phenomenal conservatism. So, first of all, I just presented this self-defeat argument in favour of phenomenal conservatism, but the opponent of phenomenal conservatism might try to turn the tables here and say, well, actually, phenomenal conservatism is self-defeating. So you might be inclined to say something like this. So this is an argument that sometimes comes up in sort of less formal discussions. So I think it rests on an error, a fairly clear error, but it's just something I've seen a lot of people do. So it's maybe worth mentioning. So phenomenal conservatism says that if it seems to S that P, then in the absence of defeaters, S has some justification for believing that P. But then the objector can go, well, look, it seems to me that phenomenal conservatism is wrong. So now I have some justification for believing that phenomenal conservatism is wrong. Well, of course, hopefully it's clear. The issue here is that this overlooks the role of defeaters. The phenomenal conservative does not claim that, any seeming, regardless of other circumstances, that seemings always provide justification. No, seemings provide justification in the absence of defeaters. Now, the phenomenal conservative will present arguments in favour of phenomenal conservatism, and these arguments, if they are successful, would defeat the seeming that phenomenal conservatism is wrong. But it is true that according to phenomenal conservatism, if it seems to somebody that phenomenal conservatism is wrong, and if this person has not encountered any of the arguments in favour of phenomenal conservatism, then, yeah, maybe that person is justified in rejecting phenomenal conservatism. But it's not really clear what we can conclude from this. I don't know. That doesn't seem like it would make phenomenal conservatism self-defeating, because who cares about people who are just ignorant of the arguments, right? We have access to the arguments for and against phenomenal conservatism. So we can do better. It's just not really clear that really tells against the theory. Here's a slightly more sophisticated way of making a self-defeat argument. This comes from Michael Depaul's article, Phenomenal Conservatism and Self-Defeat. Depaul suggests that trouble arises for the phenomenal conservative because, according to phenomenal conservatism, seemings only provide prima facie justification. The fact that it seems to me that P doesn't in itself justify me in believing that P. I'm only justified in believing that P in the absence of defeaters. So as we've seen, there are two conditions that have to be met. The conditions are, number one, it seems to me that P, and number two, I have no defeaters for this seeming. And obviously that second condition is very important, otherwise all sorts of absurd beliefs would be licensed. But Depaul objects, the problem here is that nobody's belief that P will be based on its seeming that P and the absence of defeaters for P. Now, I find Depaul's argument here a little obscure, but his point seems to be that when I form a belief now, I cannot rule out that defeaters may arise in the future. So, I guess the point is, so the issue here is, what are my beliefs based on? When I form a belief now, that belief can't be based on things that may or may not happen in the future. Indeed, actually, I can't rule out that, so I can't rule out now that I already have defeaters now that I just haven't considered yet. When I form a belief now, it can't be based on things that I may or may not consider in the future. So when I form the belief that P, that's going to be based on the seeming that P. It's not going to be based on the absence of defeaters. There is something kind of odd, really, I suppose, about forming something happening on the basis of just an absence, right? But certainly when I form the belief, when I form belief now, that's not going to be based on what I may or may not do or consider or encounter in the future. So, the phenomenal conservative makes this point that all our beliefs are based on seemings, but actually that entails that our beliefs are based on only one of the conditions that phenomenal conservatism requires for justification. By phenomenal conservatism's own lights, seemings are not in themselves an adequate source of justification. So this gives us the argument that all our beliefs, all beliefs that are plausibly justified, are based on seemings. A belief is justified only if it is based on an adequate source of justification. So if seemings are not an adequate source of justification, none of our beliefs are justified. But according to phenomenal conservatism, seemings are not an adequate source of justification. And the reason why the seemings are not an adequate source of justification is because absence of defeaters is also required. So according to phenomenal conservatism, none of our beliefs are justified. So yeah, I mean, the crux of this argument really is the claim that our beliefs are not based on the absence of defeaters. Unfortunately, Depaul doesn't really elaborate that point in much detail, and it looks like the phenomenal conservative could just reject it and say, actually, no, beliefs are based on the absence of defeaters. So, I mean, let's think about a standard case. When I consider some proposition P, I evaluate the arguments both for it and against it. And maybe I come to see that none of the arguments against it are successful. So I end up endorsing the proposition, right? I mean, so the fact that I take none of the arguments against P to be successful, that plays a role in why I form the belief that P is correct. And in this case, it looks like my belief is based on the absence of defeaters, or at least on what I take to be the absence of defeaters. Now, of course, I might encounter a defeater in the future, or I might already possess evidence that I haven't considered that I would take to be a defeater. But I mean, so what? I haven't considered it yet. So right now, from my point of view, it's not a defeater, or it's not a defeater that I'm aware of. But I have thought through some potential defeaters. I've seen that actually, nope, those defeaters don't work. So that seems reasonable to describe that as me forming a belief on the basis of what I take to be an absence of defeaters. Okay, so anyway, that was one objection. Let's move on. So the most popular objection to phenomenal conservatism is that it is excessively permissive. On phenomenal conservatism, any seeming whatsoever is a source of prima facie justification. But there might be a host of crazy seemings. For example, suppose that it seems to verity that some religion is true. God exists, God is her commander, and God commands her to kill all of the non-believers. She has an extremely strong inclination to take it that her holy book is true. You know, this impresses itself upon her just as strongly as the visual appearance that she has hands. And we can also imagine that verity is being brought up in an isolated community where everybody shares her religious extremism. In her community, all of the relevant experts accept the religion. Everything in her life is kind of structured around the religion and seems compatible with the religion. So, you know, she doesn't have any defeaters from her own point of view. So it seems that on phenomenal conservatism, her belief in the religion is justified, and her belief that she ought to kill the infidels, that is also justified. So it seems like, yeah, somebody could have this sort of psychological profile, but the objection goes, surely it's absurd to say that her beliefs are justified, right? Clearly she's not justified in believing that she ought to exterminate all the infidels. Indeed, we would probably take verity to be a paradigm example of somebody who holds an irrational belief. If you were to sort of give the best examples of irrationality, we'd probably point to someone like Verity. So, I mean, the problem here is just that phenomenal conservatism seems to give the wrong account of rationality and justification in cases like this. So that's one point, right? So one problem here is, well, this just seems to be, it kind of violates what we expect the right claim to be about rationality and justification. But moreover, the argument may be made that phenomenal conservatism has morally abhorrent implications, because phenomenal conservatism arguably implies that it is morally acceptable for people like Verity to engage in acts of terrorism, or at least that Verity is morally blameless for this. Clayton Littlejohn, in the article Defeating Phenomenal Conservatism, presents the following argument. Premise 1, if the agent justifiably judges that she should V, the agent is justified in Ving. So the agent is justified in doing V. Premise 2, phenomenal conservatism implies that an agent can justifiably judge that she ought to engage in religious terrorism. Conclusion, phenomenal conservatism implies that an agent who justifiably judges that she ought to engage in acts of terrorism acts permissibly in acting in accordance with these judgments. So basically the thought here is that if I'm epistemically justified in believing that I ought to perform some action, then I am morally blameless for performing that action. So in the example that we've given, phenomenal conservatism says it's rational for Verity to conclude that she ought to kill the infidels. Verity is justified in believing that she ought to kill the infidels. She hasn't made any epistemic error in coming to that conclusion. Given the environment in which she was raised, given the way things seem to her, her reasoning is impeccable. So she has a justified belief, I ought to kill the infidels. But then it would seem ridiculous to blame her for acting on that belief. What would the blame be based on? So we're claiming that, Verity should believe, she ought to believe that she ought to kill the infidels. She ought to hold that belief. Yet at the same time, she ought to refrain from killing anybody? She ought to refrain from killing anybody while believing that she ought to kill the infidels. And moreover, she ought to believe that she ought to kill the infidels. That is the correct conclusion for her to draw, given phenomenal conservatism. But still, she shouldn't act on that. I mean, that just seems kind of bizarre. So one way to frame this is as a dilemma, right? Either Verity is blameless for engaging in religious terrorism, but that's just morally awful, or we have a situation where reason is divided against itself in a very strange way. We're saying that Verity should believe that she ought to kill the infidels, but she also ought to refrain from killing the infidels. She ought not to act on that belief. Verity's judgment is justified. She's blameless for the judgment, but her actions are unjustified. She is blameworthy for her actions. That seems, that just seems very strange, right? That's one sort of crazy appearance. Obviously, it's easy to construct other examples of these sorts of crazy seemings. It might be the case that every time I look at the wall in front of me, I find myself struck by it seeming to be the case that there is intelligent life in the Andromeda Galaxy. Well, now I have some justification for believing that there's intelligent life in the Andromeda Galaxy. We can find loads of cases of these sorts of really just weird seemings. So what's the response to this? Well, generally, phenomenal conservatives will just accept that in cases like the ones we've described, the agent does have prima facie justification for believing what seems to be the case. But the argument will be that this does not spell too much trouble for the theory, because these sorts of scenarios are not actually all that realistic. In the real world, there are plenty of undercutting defeaters for Verity's religious extremism. Even if Verity has been raised in an isolated community, she must know that there are people who accept other religions. Otherwise, she, I mean, the belief that infidels ought to be killed would, I mean, that just wouldn't be of any importance to her. So, like, she knows that there are conflicting religions. She knows that religious beliefs are strongly influenced by the culture in which a person is raised. This sort of stuff should lead her to doubt that her own religious belief, is truth-tracking. In almost any realistic scenario, actually, even by phenomenal conservatism's lights, Verity's beliefs will not be justified. There will be defeaters. Now, of course, we can construct unrealistic scenarios where Verity's extremist beliefs are justified, but then the claim is, well, it's just not clear that we should really put much weight on our intuitions about those sorts of unrealistic scenarios. Okay, a further objection to phenomenal conservatism appeals to cognitive penetration. The idea of cognitive penetration is that capacities such as perception, memory, introspection can be influenced by other psychological states. In particular, they can be influenced by our beliefs. What I seem to perceive, or seem to remember, or seem to introspect may well be influenced by what I believe. And there are cases where this is very useful, where this enhances our abilities. So when I look out at a field, I have the perceptual seeming that there is a tree in the field. Not much I can do with that. An expert dendrologist looking at the same field might have the perceptual seeming that there is a young sycamore tree in the field. Right, like their perceptual seemings, at least with respect to trees, are much more sophisticated than mine. That kind of knowledge is obviously useful, but then there are going to be cases of defective cognitive penetration that create some strange situations for phenomenal conservatism. So suppose that Verity is paranoid and forms the belief that Sydney dislikes her, and she forms this belief for what would be regarded by everybody as bad reasons, or maybe just no reason at all. Right? Maybe Verity gets hit on the head. This results in brain damage, which manifests as paranoia directed at Sydney. So to begin with here, then, Verity has an unjustified belief that Sydney dislikes her. But now this belief starts affecting her experiences. So when Verity is with Sydney and he talks to her and looks at her, she can see malice in his face. His facial expressions just seem to her to be malicious. Similarly, when Sydney talks, she hears a sarcastic, negative, aggressive tone to his voice. Sydney's voice seems to Verity to be malicious. Now, importantly, other people do not interpret Sydney this way, and if Verity had not formed the prior belief that Sydney disliked her, then she wouldn't perceive him in this way either. Her negative perception of Sydney is caused by her prior belief. So, I mean, to a large extent, it's an empirical question whether this kind of cognitive penetration would happen. But, I mean, this seems like a plausible enough scenario, right? So it might be the case that human minds work this way. So it's reasonable to wonder about what epistemological theories would say about these situations. So, it may be that, like, in most circumstances, perhaps this kind of cognitive penetration, like, doesn't happen, so it isn't so strong, but, for all we know, it might well be. And certainly this doesn't seem particularly outlandish. So, we have this situation where Verity forms the belief that Sydney dislikes her, and then that belief starts affecting her experiences. But now Verity does not realise that her perceptual experience of Sydney has been influenced by her prior belief. Moreover, Verity is not aware of any other defeaters for her belief that Sydney dislikes her. So it seems to Verity that Sydney dislikes her, and she has no defeaters for this seeming. So now, according to phenomenal conservatism, she has some justification for the belief that Sydney dislikes her. And so notice what's happened here. Verity begins with an unjustified belief. This belief then influences her perception, which creates a seeming, and then that seeming provides justification for the belief. So the belief has created justification for itself. Now, I mean, so first of all, we might think there's just something weird about the notion that beliefs could justify themselves, or at least that, like, an initially unjustified belief could become justified in this way. That we might think, look, if a belief is unjustified, it shouldn't be able to create justification for itself. And then second, notice that in this case there are two steps to the justification, and both of these steps seem defective, right? So the first step is the formation of the unjustified belief. Well, that's, I mean, just by stipulation, I guess that involves some sort of defect, right? Something has gone wrong when verity initially forms that belief. Then the second step is that this belief influences verity's perceptual states. Again, this seems to involve some sort of defect. Verity is being led astray. She's a victim of a kind of illusion. So again, something has gone wrong here. And yet, from these missteps, phenomenal conservatism tells us that verity ends up with a justified belief. So that seems a bit strange. Okay, well, that is all I wanted to say about that. That's as I say, just a brief outline of phenomenal conservatism. Hope that was helpful. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.